The air over the Singapore Naval Base in December 1941 is a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of tropical humidity you can feel on your skin and taste on your tongue. It's thick with a strange perfume of empire and nature at odds, the sharp metallic tang of diesel fuel and salt water mingling with the sweet, heavy scent of frangipani blossoms wilting in the heat. A harsh white sun glints off the colossal grey hull of the HMS Prince of Wales, a steel behemoth so vast it seems to bend the very horizon around its form. On board, the world is one of ordered, polished British steel and brass, a universe of discipline and certainty. The rhythmic clang of machinery and the clipped, confident accents of the crew create a bubble of European order, a fortress of familiarity airlifted into the heart of an exotic, unknowable Southeast Asia. Below decks, the air is cooler, smelling of fresh paint, ozone and the faint, clean scent of oiled mechanisms, a sterile environment designed for maximum efficiency. It is a world away from the chaotic symphony of the docks, where the shouts of merchants, the vibrant colors of sarongs, and the complex aromas of a bustling colony fade into a distant murmur. A palpable sense of invincibility permeates every rivet and bulkhead of the ship. This is not merely a weapon of war, it is a floating declaration of imperial might, a symbol of a global power sent to stare down the ambitions of the rising sun. For the men who serve her, she is more than a vessel. She is a creed, an unsinkable article of faith forged in the shipyards of home and destined for glory. Aboard this steel titan, able seaman Thomas Finch, just 19, feels the thrum of the ship's engines in his very bones. A boy from Portsmouth, with a face yet to be hardened by the true brutalities of war, he is filled with an earnest pride that shines in his eyes. For him, the Prince of Wales is the entire world, a magnificent symbol of a power he now feels is his own. His motivation is as simple and pure as the polished brasswork around him: to serve aboard the greatest battleship ever built, to do his duty for king and country, and to return home with stories of high adventure to tell his sweetheart. His only weakness, a flaw he shares with every man on board from the Admiral down, is an unshakable, almost religious faith in the supremacy of the battleship over every other form of warfare, especially the nascent, unproven threat of air power. If you are a fan of these epic tales of naval history, comment with where you're watching from. The command comes, and the great ship, along with its companion HMS Repulse, slips its moorings and steams out into the open sea. The mission: to intercept a rumored Japanese invasion force. As the Singapore coastline recedes, a mood of confident purpose settles over the crew. They are lions venturing from their lair, instruments of a righteous and inevitable authority. The humid chaos of the port is replaced by the clean, vast emptiness of the South China Sea. The sky above is a boundless dome of pale blue, seemingly devoid of threat, a canvas of serene infinity. The ships cut through the turquoise water with an effortless grace, two grey sharks gliding through their natural element, supremely confident in their design, their training, and their destiny. The air is clear, the mission is simple, and failure is a concept that does not exist in their vocabulary. The first alarm shatters the calm. A distant drone, at first mistaken for a friendly patrol, quickly resolves into the distinct shape of enemy aircraft. The response is immediate, disciplined, almost arrogant in its readiness. On the anti-aircraft batteries, Tommy Finch and his comrades move with the seamless precision of a well-oiled machine. The guns erupt in a deafening, perfectly orchestrated symphony of destruction, flinging shells into the sky to weave a deadly net of flak. This is what they trained for, a scenario played out 100 times in drills. But the Japanese torpedo bombers, the Mitsubishi G4Ms the Allies nicknamed Betties, do not follow the rules of European warfare. They don't fly high as expected, but come in low and fast, their fuselages almost skimming the churning waves, like silver needles aimed at the heart of a giant. The first torpedo strikes the Prince of Wales on the port side, near the stern. It is not just an explosion. It is a profound physical violation, a sacrilege against the laws of nature as the crew understands them. A bone-jarring shudder runs through the 44,000-ton vessel, a tremor of mortality that travels from the keel to the mast. The thick deck plates beneath Tommy's feet groan in protest, a sound of wounded metal he has never heard before. For the first time, the ship, their invincible fortress, feels vulnerable, mortal. A wave of silence follows the blast, a momentary vacuum in the chaos of battle. And on the faces of the sailors is not yet fear, but something far deeper. A sheer, uncomprehending disbelief. The impossible has just happened. The god has just been made to bleed. The initial shockwave subsides, leaving behind a ringing silence more terrifying than the explosion itself. This quiet is punctuated by the deep guttural groan of stressed steel, the sound of a giant's bones breaking. For able seaman Tommy Finch, the world has tilted on its axis, both literally and figuratively. The deck beneath his feet, once a symbol of unshakable stability, now lists at a sickening angle. He sees the faces of his comrades, men who minutes ago were laughing with the easy confidence of the invincible, now pale masks of confusion. It isn't fear that grips them yet, but a profound, paralyzing bewilderment. Their ship, the physical embodiment of the British Empire's might, has been wounded by an enemy they were taught to disdain. The air, thick with the acrid smell of cordite, carries an unspoken question that hangs heavier than the smoke. How? How was this possible? The fortress had been breached not by a rival giant, but by a swarm of insects. Before the first question can even be fully formed, a second thunderclap rips through the vessel. Another torpedo, another violation. This one hits closer to the heart, sending a tremor that feels final, fatal. The lights flicker violently, casting the frantic scene in strobing, hellish flashes, before plunging entire sections into an abyssal darkness. A new sound joins the symphony of destruction. The high-pitched scream of escaping steam and the horrifying, relentless rush of the ocean pouring into the ship's metallic lungs. The Prince of Wales, a masterpiece of engineering designed to withstand the heaviest naval guns, is being surgically dismantled. Its advanced rudder jams, its electrical systems fail. In a matter of moments, the ship is no longer a hunter but a crippled beast, circling helplessly in the water as the predators gather for the final kill. The neatly drawn lines between order and chaos, between certainty and dread, have been irrevocably erased. The ship's internal nervous system begins to collapse. Damage control parties, trained to perfection in the calm waters of Scapa Flow, rush into the darkness, their shouted commands swallowed by the roar of incoming seawater. But this is not a drill. The neatly compartmentalized problems of training exercises have become a cascading, uncontrollable failure. The tilting decks turn familiar passageways into treacherous, gravity-defying traps. Water, black and slick with oil, rises with astonishing speed, claiming territory deck by deck. For Tommy, the ship transforms from a home into a tomb. The very steel that was his armor now feels like the walls of a cage, and the sea, the element they were meant to command, has become their executioner. The intricate, logical world of the battleship has devolved into a primal struggle against gravity and the unforgiving ocean. Above, the sky is no longer an empty canvas, but a theater of calculated lethality. The Japanese Betty bombers are not a reckless mob. They move with a terrifying balletic precision. They wheel and turn, patient and observant, their silver fuselages glinting in the tropical sun. They are artists of destruction, using the vastness of the sea as their workspace. They approach from multiple angles, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm the ship's defenses, to exploit every weakness. To the sailors below, they seem to operate with a different understanding of time and space, defying the established doctrines of naval combat. Each plane that peels off for its torpedo run is not just delivering a weapon, it is delivering a verdict on a century of naval tradition, a verdict on the very idea of the unsinkable battleship. Separated from his gun station by a warped bulkhead, Tommy is cast adrift inside the dying Leviathan. His journey through the darkened, tilting corridors is a descent into a mechanical underworld. He stumbles past the central plotting room, where the pride of the Royal Navy's technology, the Admiralty fire control table, sits inert and useless, its intricate gears and dials silenced by the flooding. He sees gun turrets, each weighing more than a destroyer, frozen at useless angles, their immense power rendered impotent. Every failed system is a clue, every flooded compartment another piece of evidence in a horrifying investigation. He is not investigating the enemy, but the catastrophic failure of his own world. The ship is speaking to him in its death throes, revealing the fatal flaw that lay hidden beneath its armor, an arrogance that had blinded it to the future of war. He finds his way to a companionway, and sees Captain Leach on the bridge. His face etched not with panic, but with a look of grim, stoic acceptance. The command structure is intact, but the tools of command are gone. It is in that moment of seeing authority rendered powerless that the mystery solidifies for Tommy. The true enemy was never just the planes in the sky. It was an idea, the belief that steel was stronger than strategy, that tradition could hold back the tide of innovation. They were fighting a new kind of war with the weapons and mindset of the old one. The shock was not simply that their ship was sinking, but that the entire universe of assumptions upon which their lives were built was sinking with it. The water rising around his ankles was the cold, hard proof that their faith had been misplaced. The world inside the HMS Prince of Wales had become an alien landscape of skewed angles and treacherous surfaces. For Tommy Finch, the investigation began not as a conscious choice, but as a primal need to understand the physics of his own survival. He clung to a bulkhead, the once vertical wall now a steep, slick incline, and watched as a torrent of seawater, black and iridescent with oil, cascaded down a grand staircase meant for officers in crisp white uniforms. The ship was no longer just listing. It was surrendering to a new, malevolent form of gravity. His first clue was the silence where there should have been the hum of life. The constant thrum of the generators was gone, replaced by the agonizing creak of a structure tearing itself apart. The ship's heart had stopped beating, its electrical veins severed, leaving it a paralyzed giant waiting for the ocean to claim it. He pushed onward, deeper into the mechanical labyrinth, his path lit by the emergency battle lanterns that cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar corridors into a gallery of horrors. He stumbled upon a damage control team, their faces grim under helmets, battling a geyser of water erupting from a ruptured pipe. They moved with desperate, practiced efficiency, but their tools, heavy wrenches and wooden plugs, seemed like children's toys against the immense, hydraulic pressure of the South China Sea. Here was the second clue. They were fighting a flood, but the wound was too deep, too catastrophic. The ship's compartmentalization, a marvel of naval architecture designed to contain damage from shell fire, was proving tragically ineffective against the surgical, debilitating trauma inflicted by the torpedoes. They were trying to patch a severed artery with a bandage, their training a testament to a type of war that was no longer being fought. In a junction near the engine rooms, the heat was suffocating, thick with the smell of hot metal and steam. An engineering officer, his face smeared with grease, was yelling into a voice pipe, the primitive brass tube a stark symbol of their technological regression. The ship's advanced internal communication system, a complex web of telephones and transmitters, was dead. This magnificent state-of-the-art war machine, a city of steel with its own power grid and command center, was now reduced to shouting into metal funnels. The contradiction was staggering. They possessed the world's most sophisticated naval gunnery computer, yet they couldn't speak from one compartment to the next. The enemy hadn't just punched a hole in their armor, they had systematically dismantled their nervous system, proving that a giant's strength is useless without the nerves to control it. The attack was not just brutal, it was intelligent. Finding a hatch that led to a shattered observation deck, Tommy clawed his way into the blinding tropical light. The chaos of the battle was still raging, but from this new vantage point, he could see it with a horrifying clarity. The Japanese bombers were not a frantic swarm. They moved with a chilling, predatory grace, like a pack of wolves coordinating to bring down a bison. They circled patiently, out of range of the remaining flak, and then one would peel off, descending into its attack run with an unnerving steadiness. There was no wasted motion, no sign of the fanatical recklessness they had been taught to expect. This was the work of disciplined, highly trained pilots, executing a perfect plan. The realization struck Tommy with the force of another explosion. They had not only underestimated the enemy's machines, but they had fatally underestimated the men who flew them. An older sailor, a man with a face like a worn sea chart, who had been at Jutland, huddled beside him, his eyes wide with a kind of sacred horror. "This ain't right," the old man rasped, his voice barely audible over the din. "This ain't how it's done. A ship fights a ship. That's the way of it." In that simple, bewildered statement, Tommy found the heart of the mystery. The entire philosophy of the Royal Navy, a century of tradition built on the supremacy of the great gunned warship, was being rendered obsolete in a matter of minutes. They had sailed into the future, armed with the glorious weapons of the past. The Prince of Wales wasn't just a ship. It was a floating doctrine, an article of faith. And the faith was breaking apart, its steel commandments shattered by a new and terrifying testament written in the sky. Another silver fish cut through the water, its wake a perfectly straight line aimed at the HMS Repulse, their struggling consort. Tommy watched, mesmerized by its deadly purpose. They had been told that aerial torpedoes were unreliable, inaccurate weapons that had to be dropped at low speeds, making the aircraft easy targets. But what he was witnessing was a display of lethal precision. These were not the weapons they had trained against. This was something new, something faster and more resilient. A horrifying thought began to form in his mind. What if the enemy knew more about them than they knew about the enemy? What if their confidence was built not on strength, but on a foundation of ignorance? The torpedo struck the Repulse, and another plume of fire and water erupted, another exclamation point at the end of a sentence that spelled their doom. As Tommy scrambled back into the dark, tilting interior, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. It was not one single failure, but a total systemic collapse. The severed power, the jammed rudder, the underestimated pilots, the superior torpedoes, the flawed design philosophy, the rigid, outdated doctrine. Each clue was a symptom of the same disease, an unshakable pride that had rendered them blind. They were not being defeated by the Japanese Navy. They were being defeated by their own history. The water rising around their ankles was not just the sea, it was the tide of a new era, and their magnificent steel fortress, the ultimate expression of the world they knew, had no place in it. The investigation was over. He now understood how they were dying. The only question left was what it all meant. The truth of their situation was a physical thing, a jagged piece of shrapnel working its way to the heart. Yet the ship's command structure resisted it, with the full force of its institutional inertia. On the bridge, officers still spoke in the clipped, confident language of the training yard, issuing orders for counter-flooding and damage control that were based on textbook scenarios, not the cascading systemic collapse they were experiencing. Their voices, carried by the few remaining runners, were echoes from a world that had ceased to exist minutes before. Tommy watched a lieutenant calmly plotting a new course on a chart, even as the rudder was jammed and the ship was locked in a death spiral. It was a magnificent, tragic display of discipline, the refusal to accept that the rules of their universe had been violently rewritten. This was not courage, but a form of institutional blindness, a system confronting a new reality by pretending it was an old, familiar problem that could be solved with procedure and grit. This resistance was a contagion that spread through the crew, a desperate collective denial. Tommy felt it in his own gut, a voice that whispered, "This cannot be happening." Around him, men clung to the rituals of their duty, their hands performing tasks that were now meaningless, their minds rejecting the evidence of their senses. He heard a gunner's mate arguing fiercely that the ship's armor belt was simply too thick to be pierced so easily, as if his conviction could somehow weld the ruptured steel back together. They were sailors of the Royal Navy. Their ships did not simply break apart and sink under the assault of a few flimsy airplanes. Their disbelief was a shield, a final piece of psychological armor against a truth too vast and horrifying to comprehend. To accept the ship was dying was to accept that their entire world, their training, their history, and their very identity as masters of the sea was a lie. The moral conflict, once a subtle undercurrent, now raged on the tilting decks. It was the ancient war between pride and reality. Every polished brass fitting, every perfectly coiled rope, every inch of the ship's regal design was a testament to a belief in its own inherent superiority. This vessel was the physical manifestation of a century of naval dominance, a floating monument to the idea that British engineering and British character were invincible. And now, that pride was being systematically dismantled by an enemy who fought with a different creed, a creed of speed, precision, and a ruthless disregard for tradition. The Japanese pilots were not engaging in a gentlemanly duel between great ships. They were surgeons, methodically cutting the nerves and bleeding the life from a creature they knew was too powerful to confront head-on. The battle was a verdict on two empires, and the verdict was being written by torpedoes in the side of their hull. Tommy found himself stumbling through the ship's wardroom, a space of polished wood and leather chairs designed for the calm contemplation of strategy. Now it was a wreck. Maps and charts floated in the ankle-deep water, the neat lines of empire bleeding into a formless swirl. On a bulkhead, a portrait of King George VI hung crookedly, his serene, confident gaze now looking down upon a scene of utter chaos. In that moment, the confrontation became intensely personal. He wasn't just a sailor on a sinking ship. He was a subject of a crumbling kingdom. The institution that had promised him strength and purpose was failing him, its symbols of authority rendered pathetic and powerless by the rising tide. The conflict was no longer with the enemy in the sky, but with the very foundations of his belief. He was confronting the terrifying possibility that the faith he had pledged his life to was built on a fragile, hollow promise. The emotional core of this confrontation was made clear in the face of a young midshipman, no older than 16, who was trying to organize a party of men to shore up a buckling hatch. His voice cracked with a mixture of ingrained authority and naked fear, his orders swallowed by the roar of the sea. He was a boy playing a man's role, armed only with the rules from a book that no longer applied. Tommy saw in him the reflection of his own shattered innocence. They had all come aboard this ship, believing they were part of an unbreakable legacy, a story of inevitable victory. Now they were just frightened boys, trapped in a steel coffin, confronting the raw, unceremonious nature of death. The true resistance was not against the water or the enemy. It was against the loss of that beautiful, simple certainty they had carried in their hearts. It was the fight against the despair that comes when you realize the story you believed in was just a story after all. The greatest opposition, however, was intellectual. It was the struggle against a deeply ingrained doctrine that had become dogma. For generations, the Royal Navy had preached the gospel of the battleship. That command of the seas belonged to the vessel with the biggest guns and the thickest armor. This belief was not just a strategy. It was an article of faith, repeated in every classroom at Dartmouth and in every mess hall across the fleet. The aircraft was seen as a nuisance, a scout, perhaps a threat to lesser ships, but never an existential danger to a modern battleship. This intellectual pride had created a blind spot the size of an ocean. They were so convinced of their own truth that they had stopped questioning it, stopped seeing the world as it was, and instead saw only the world as their traditions told them it should be. The sinking of the Prince of Wales was the brutal, final argument in a debate they had refused to even acknowledge was happening. Slowly, painfully, the resistance began to crumble, not through a change of mind, but through the overwhelming force of physical reality. The ship gave another deep, shuddering lurch, a final surrender to the laws of physics. The angle of the list became so severe that standing was no longer possible. Men and equipment slid across the deck in a horrifying avalanche of steel and bodies. The intellectual argument was over. The emotional denial was shattered. There was no more room for pride or doctrine. There was only the cold, hard fact of the ocean, which was no longer outside but inside, claiming everything. For Tommy, this was the moment of terrifying clarity. The confrontation had ended not in victory or defeat, but in a quiet, horrifying acceptance. He finally saw the truth, not as a strategic failure, but as a law of nature. The old must always eventually give way to the new. And they were the old. The profound discovery began with the ship's own voice, a language of groaning steel and shuddering plates that spoke of an anatomy fatally misunderstood. The designers in their warm, safe offices in Bath had envisioned a war of broadsides, a thunderous duel where thick armor belts would repel heavy shells. They had armored the ship's vital organs accordingly, but they had left its legs, its Achilles heel, tragically exposed. The Japanese torpedoes, running shallow and true, did not strike the mighty armored belt. Instead, they hit the unprotected stern, shredding the thin plating around the propeller shafts. The first crippling blow didn't target the ship's heart. It severed its tendons. It was a discovery of brutal surgical precision. The realization that your enemy knows your body better than you do, and has brought not a club to the fight, but a scalpel designed for the one spot you left unguarded. With its mobility destroyed, the Prince of Wales became a case study in paralysis. The jammed rudder locked the ship into a wide, slow circle, turning the magnificent vessel into a 44,000-ton target, a wounded beast tethered to its own death spiral. The loss of the outer port propeller shaft was a catastrophic injury. The shaft, spinning at immense speed, was bent and torn from its mountings, flailing like a broken limb inside the ship's hull. It ripped through bulkheads, destroyed internal compartments, and critically, severed the main conduits for electrical power. The ship's central nervous system was instantly shattered. Lights died, communication systems went silent, and the ammunition hoists that fed the great guns ground to a halt. The giant lost its ability to walk, and then, in a matter of seconds, it lost its ability to speak or even think. This cascading failure was the next layer of the revelation. The pride of the Royal Navy's engineering, the intricate network of systems within systems, was built on an assumption of integrity. But the Japanese attack was not a single wound. It was a systemic poison. The flooding from the ruptured stern did not stay contained. It surged through the channels carved by the destroyed propeller shaft, bypassing the carefully designed compartmentalization. Water found its way into generator rooms, silencing the dynamos that gave the ship life. The very technology that made the vessel so formidable, its electrical gun turrets, its advanced fire control computers, now sat inert, monuments to a power that no longer had a source. The ship was not just sinking. It was being unmade, its complex machinery rendered back into a simple dead weight of iron. The human element of this mechanical autopsy was found in the desperate, futile work of the damage control teams. These men were the antibodies of the ship, trained to rush to any wound and seal it. But they were trained for a different disease. Their heavy wooden shores and collision mats were designed to plug holes from shells, not to stem a high-pressure deluge from a 20-foot gash deep below the waterline. Tommy watched them battle the rising tide in the dark, their movements heroic but hopeless. Their struggle revealed a deeper truth. Their training, their doctrine, their entire manual for survival was written for a war that had ended the moment the first torpedo hit the water. They were performing the correct rituals, but the gods they were praying to were already dead. From a shattered porthole, the final piece of the tactical puzzle slotted into place. The sky was not filled with a random, chaotic swarm of aircraft. The Japanese pilots were masters of a new and terrible geometry of war. They executed a perfectly coordinated anvil and hammer attack, with one group of bombers feigning an attack from one side to draw the ship's anti-aircraft fire, while another group swept in from the opposite side, low and unseen against the glare of the sea. This was not a brawl, it was a dissection. They exploited the ship's slow turning rate, its limited fields of anti-aircraft fire, and the crew's doctrinal fixation on high-altitude threats. The discovery was chilling. This was not a lucky strike. It was a plan, flawlessly executed by men who had studied their target, understood its limitations, and created a new form of combat specifically to kill it. The sum of these discoveries was a truth more devastating than the explosions themselves. The HMS Prince of Wales was not defeated. It was solved. The enemy had approached the problem of the modern battleship not as a fortress to be assaulted, but as a complex machine to be disabled. They identified its key vulnerabilities: the unarmored stern, the reliance on a centralized electrical grid, and a tactical doctrine that left it blind to low-level multi-axis attacks. They built the perfect key, the Type 91 aerial torpedo modified for shallow waters, to unlock its destruction. The sinking was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was the elegant, horrifying proof of a mathematical theorem, a theorem that stated that a century of naval power could be negated by a new idea, delivered with precision and courage. And so, as the deck tilted towards its final irreversible angle, Tommy Finch understood the how. He understood the physics of the ruptured hull, the logic of the severed power lines, and the brutal genius of the enemy's strategy. The mystery of the sinking was laid bare, a collection of fatal design flaws, tactical miscalculations, and technological shortcomings. Yet this clinical understanding did nothing to soothe the soul. It only opened the door to a much larger, more terrifying question. Knowing how their world was ending did not explain why. Why had they been so blind? Why had their pride, their tradition, and their confidence led them into this perfectly engineered trap? The mechanics of the disaster were clear, but the meaning behind it remained a profound and aching void. The final order came not as a panicked shout, but as a quiet admission of defeat, passed from man to man with the solemnity of a final prayer. Abandon ship. The words themselves seemed impossible, a phrase from a different language meant for other navies, other men. On the steeply canted deck, the disciplined chaos of battle dissolved into the stark individual calculus of survival. The fight was over. The intricate choreography of duty, the lifetime of training that bound them together as a single fighting entity, evaporated in the face of a simple primal command from the laws of physics. Tommy watched as men, boys, like him and veterans who had seen it all, let go of their stations, their faces blank with a grief too profound for fear. They were no longer sailors of the greatest battleship afloat. They were merely men on a mountain of steel that was sliding into the sea. The ship itself seemed to concur, its groans growing deeper, longer, the size of a dying creature surrendering its ghost. He scrambled across the hull, which was no longer a deck but a slippery, angled cliff face. The sea, once a distant, conquered element, now clawed at the ship's railings, impatient and hungry. There was no elegant escape, only a clumsy, desperate fall into the churning water below. The impact was a brutal shock, a baptism into a new and terrifying reality. The water was warm, thick and suffocating, a blanket of oil and diesel fuel that stung his eyes and choked his throat. He surfaced, gasping, and turned to look back at the source of his entire world. The sight was a monstrous, beautiful blasphemy. The HMS Prince of Wales was rolling over in a slow, majestic agony. Its colossal red-painted underbelly rose to the sky, and then its two massive inner propellers lifted clear of the waves, spinning uselessly in the humid air. It was the final, impotent gesture of a dethroned king, a display of immense power with nothing left to push against. The end came with a sound that was not the roar he expected, but a deep, resonant sigh. It was the sound of 1,000,000 cubic feet of air being driven from the ship's metallic lungs by the weight of the ocean, a final exhalation of a life measured in tons of steel and miles of wiring. The great vessel, the symbol of an empire's reach and the pride of a nation, slid backward into the sea with a strange, almost gentle grace. The stern went first, and the white ensign, the flag they had sworn to defend, dipped below the waves without ceremony, simply erased from the world. For a moment the bow pointed to the sky, a final silent accusation, before it too was swallowed by the turquoise water. And then there was nothing. A patch of foaming, oil-slicked sea, where a fortress had stood just 90 minutes before. A profound, hollow void on the surface of the world. In the silence that followed, a quiet so absolute it felt louder than the battle, Tommy floated amidst the wreckage. The Japanese planes were gone, their terrible work completed with an artist's efficiency. There was only the vast indifferent sky above and the vast indifferent sea below. He was surrounded by the debris of his former life, splintered wood, empty shell casings, and the bobbing heads of other survivors, their faces masks of oil and disbelief. They were tiny, insignificant specks in the immensity of the ocean, their individual struggles and losses reduced to a footnote in the day's brutal history. The sun beat down with the same tropical intensity. The waves lapped with the same gentle rhythm. The world had not paused. Nature had not mourned. The stage of their tragedy was already being cleared, the evidence of their failure already being scattered by the currents. It was there, in that sacred, terrible quiet, that the truth finally found him. He had spent the last hour trying to solve the mechanics of their defeat, the flawed armor, the jammed rudder, the superior torpedoes. But the answer was not in the engineering. It was in the silence. They were not defeated by a better weapon, but by a better idea. Their unshakable faith in the battleship was a magnificent, heavy anchor that chained them to the past, and they had been drowned by the relentless tide of the future. The Japanese pilots had not just aimed for their hull. They had aimed for their certainty, for the very center of their belief system. The shock was not the sinking of a ship. It was the sinking of an entire world. The violent, undeniable proof that the story they told themselves was no longer true. They had sailed into a new era, armed with nothing but the glorious, obsolete armor of their own pride. The sinking of the HMS Prince of Wales was not merely the loss of a ship. It was a eulogy for an age. For Tommy Finch, floating in the warm waters of the South China Sea, the revelation was as clear and as cold as the depths beneath him. The true enemy had never been the planes in the sky, but the blindness in their own hearts. They had built a fortress of steel to protect them from the world, but they had forgotten that the most formidable walls and the most fatal prisons are the ones we build in our own minds. Technology, tradition, and the weight of history are no defense against a new reality you refuse to see. In the end, the ocean claims all ships, but the most tragic wrecks are those of empires that sink beneath the weight of their own arrogance, leaving behind only the quiet, timeless lesson that pride is a current that always leads to ruin. Years later, the oil would disperse, the wreckage would be colonized by the sea, and the names of the dead would be etched into stone memorials half a world away. But for able seaman Thomas Finch, and for the other survivors who bobbed in that warm, indifferent water, the silence that followed the sinking was a permanent thing, a sound that would echo for the rest of their lives. It was the sound of a world ending. The tropical sun, which had once glinted off the polished brass and grey steel of their invincible fortress, now simply warmed their oil-stained faces, a neutral observer to their grief. In that profound quiet, surrounded by the flotsam of their shattered reality, the true nature of their loss began to settle. It was not just a ship they had lost, but a certainty. They were adrift in more than just the ocean. They were adrift in a new and terrifying century they no longer understood. They were a scattered constellation of ghosts, their white uniforms blackened, their faces masks of shock. Each man was an island of private grief, yet they were all bound by a single shared experience. They had witnessed the death of a god. The camaraderie forged in the close quarters of the mess decks and the disciplined chaos of the gun turrets had been replaced by a new, unspoken bond, the brotherhood of the shipwrecked, of those who had seen the impossible made real. The loss of the Prince of Wales, followed so swiftly by the sinking of its companion HMS Repulse, was not a simple defeat. It was an amputation. 2 great limbs of the Empire had been severed in less than 2 hours, leaving the body of the Royal Navy in the Far East mortally wounded, its reputation for invincibility bleeding out into the turquoise water. The survivors were the living proof that the age of the battleship had died that afternoon. The journey from the arrogant departure at Singapore to this desolate aftermath was a voyage of only a few days, but it spanned an entire historical era. The confidence that had filled the ship's corridors now seemed like a form of madness, a collective delusion born of a glorious past that had no bearing on the present. The Prince of Wales was more than a weapon. It was a floating argument for the enduring power of tradition and might. Its sinking was the brutal, irrefutable counter-argument. The wreckage settling on the seabed was not just twisted steel. It was the physical evidence of a failed doctrine, a monument to the fatal danger of believing your own legends. The harsh white sun that once illuminated a symbol of imperial strength now shone down upon its grave, revealing the stark truth that no empire, no matter how powerful, can command the tides of change to stand still. This is a story that belongs not only to the sea, but to all of us. The fate of the great ship is a timeless parable for any institution, any nation, or any individual who becomes so encased in the armor of their own success that they can no longer feel the world changing around them. It is a lesson about the peril of mistaking confidence for wisdom and of viewing the future through the narrow lens of the past. The Japanese pilots were not merely the enemy. They were messengers, delivering a violent and undeniable dispatch that the rules had been rewritten. The Royal Navy had prepared for a war of grand, familiar gestures, a duel of giants, only to be undone by a new kind of thinking, one that valued speed, precision, and the courage to defy convention. Their tragedy was to be perfectly prepared for a world that had, without their noticing, already vanished. The final, inescapable truth that settled in Tommy's soul was not a complex strategic analysis, but a simple, profound moral. The greatest walls we build are not made of steel, but of pride. The ship's armor belt, forged to withstand the heaviest shells, offered no protection against an idea whose time had come. Their faith in their own invincibility became a shroud, blinding them to the clear and present danger that flew towards them under the tropical sun. Technology and tradition, for all their power, are a fragile defense against a reality you refuse to see. The sinking was not a failure of courage or of engineering alone, but a catastrophic failure of imagination. They were defeated not by the enemy's strength, but by the brittleness of their own certainty, proving that the heaviest anchor of all is the one that moors us to our own arrogance. And so, the story ends where it began, in the water under a vast and silent sky. The ripples from that day in the South China Sea spread across the globe, forever changing the face of naval warfare. The age of the airplane had arrived, and the reign of the battleship was over. What remains is not just the memory of a great ship's loss, but the enduring echo of its lesson. It is a quiet reminder that true strength is not the refusal to fall, but the willingness to see, to adapt, and to understand that the future will always belong to those who are not afraid to let go of the past. If you believe that history's most powerful, lessons are written not in the roar of battle, but in the silence that follows, share your thoughts in the comments, for it is in that quiet that we find the wisdom to navigate the tides ahead.